The distress beacon had been broadcasting for 11 hours before Corporal Dane Harlow decided to do something about it. His commanding officer had said to ignore it. The signal was coming from a wrecked Vorkai fighter, and the Vorkai were not allies. They were not neutral parties. They were the enemy, the same species that had glassed 2 human colonies in the Outer Rim and left 6,000 people as ash on a dead rock. Command had been clear. No aid. No contact. Maintain position and wait for extraction. Dane was waiting. He was just also walking toward the signal at the same time. The crash site was 3 kilometers from the human forward operating base on Kaleth 9. A freezing moon with gray rock and gray sky and wind that cut through standard issue gear like it had a personal grudge. The Vorkai fighter had gone down hard. It nose first into a ravine, and it was burning with the low orange fire that Vorkai fuel cells made when they were dying out. Dane stopped at the edge of the ravine and looked down. 2 cubs. That was the word that came to him. Not soldiers, not enemies. Cubs. They were small, maybe a quarter of the size of a full-grown Vorkai warrior. Their fur was patchy and pale, and they were huddled against the side of the wreck in a way that told him they had not moved in a long time. One was making a sound he had never heard a Vorkai make. It took him a moment to realize it was crying. He had seen Vorkai warriors in battle. They were something close to terrifying. 7 feet of muscle and bone and instinct, with reflexes that made human soldiers look like they were moving underwater. They did not cry. They did not look small. They did not look like they needed anything from anyone. These 2 needed something. He climbed down into the ravine. Up close, they were even younger than he had thought. Their eyes were still the pale gray of young Vorkai, who had not yet reached their color change, which happened at adolescence. Both were injured. One had a gash along its left foreleg, wrapped badly in what looked like torn fabric from a flight suit. The other was shaking in a way that was not from cold. Dane crouched down 3 meters away and did not move fast. He had served 6 years in the human-Vorkai conflict. He had done a full cycle of cross-species contact training because his first posting had been on the border, where knowing Vorkai body language was the difference between a tense standoff and a firefight. He knew that direct eye contact with a young Vorkai read as aggression. He knew that open hands, held low, read as non-threatening. He held his hands open. He looked at the ground. Neither cub moved. He reached into his pack slowly. He had 4 ration bars left. 2 were his for the rest of the day. 1 was tomorrow's breakfast, and 1 he had been saving because it was the caramel flavor, and those were the only ones he actually liked. He took all 4 out and set them on the ground. He pushed them forward a half meter. He moved back. The cubs stared at the ration bars. Vorkai were carnivores. Human ration bars were probably not what they needed, but they were something. They were warm in the hand. They smelled like food. And these 2 cubs had been sitting next to a cooling wreck for 11 hours with nothing. The smaller one moved first. It crawled forward on its belly, watching Dane the whole time, and sniffed the ration bar closest to it. It picked it up with both forepaws. It bit into it, and its expression went through several stages that Dane could only read as confusion, followed by something that might have been tolerance. It ate the whole thing. The other one watched, and then took one too. Dane sat back against the ravine wall and watched them eat. The wind was still cutting and the fire was almost gone, and in about 40 minutes the temperature was going to drop another 8 degrees. He pulled out his emergency thermal blanket, the thin silver one that folded down to nothing, and spread it out between himself and the cubs. Not over them, not touching them, just there. The larger cub looked at the blanket, looked at Dane, and looked at the blanket. Then it dragged the blanket over the smaller one with one paw. Dane almost laughed. He swallowed it down. He keyed his radio. "Harlow to base." "Go ahead, Harlow." "I found the source of the beacon. 2 juvenile Vorkai, survivors of the crash. They need medical attention and extraction. I need you to contact Vorkai Command through the emergency channel and let them know we have their people." There was a long pause on the radio. "Corporal, I'm going to remind you that Command said—" "I know what Command said. I'm telling you what I found. 2 injured kids. They need a doctor and they need their people." He paused. "I'll wait here with them until someone comes." Another pause. Longer this time. "Understood, Harlow. Stand by." He put the radio down and looked at the cubs. And the smaller one had fallen asleep under the thermal blanket. The larger one was still watching him with those pale gray eyes. Dane reached into his pack and found the last thing in there he hadn't taken out. A protein stick, the dense kind, high calorie. He held it out. The cub stared at it for a long moment. Then it reached out and took it. Dane nodded. "You're going to be okay," he said, knowing full well the cub could not understand a word. "Someone's coming." The larger cub held the protein stick and did not eat it. It just held it and kept watching him. Dane had no way to know, sitting in that freezing ravine with the fire burned down to nothing, that the cub's mother was a war commander. He had no way to know her name was Vethara, or that she had been 2 jumps away when her fighter's emergency beacon cut out, or that she had turned her entire assault carrier around and was already burning hard toward Calith 9. He had no way to know that she was going to land, walk into that ravine, and look at her cubs alive and wrapped in a human silver blanket and eating human food. He did not know any of it yet. He just sat in the cold and waited. The Vorkai assault carrier dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Calith system and burned hard toward the moon without slowing to standard approach speed. Every ship in the system, human and otherwise, picked up the drive signature. It was not a subtle arrival. Vethara did not do subtle when her children were involved. She was in the command chair when her navigator told her they were 6 minutes out. She did not respond. She was already standing. Garge already moving toward the landing bay, already pulling on her ground armor. Her second in command, a senior officer named Kethon, who had served under her for 9 years, followed 3 steps behind and said nothing. He knew better than to speak when she moved like this. The beacon had gone dark 11 hours ago. She had been in the middle of a command briefing with 3 other war commanders when the alert came through. She had left mid-sentence. No explanation. Everyone in the room had let her go. That was the other thing about Vethara. She held the highest confirmed victory count of any active Vorkai commander. She had taken 3 human warships in single engagements. She had held a contested system for 4 months with half a fleet. There was not a commander on either side of the conflict who did not know her name. She was also, factually, the most dangerous thing in this entire star system. And right now, she was calculating exactly what she was going to do to whoever was responsible for her children's distress beacon going dark. Her ship hit atmosphere, and she felt the vibration of re-entry in her boots. The beacon had been transmitting from the crash site of a reconnaissance fighter. Her children had been aboard that fighter because her children were always with her on the carrier, and the carrier had been running a patrol rotation, and somehow, the fighter had gone down. She did not have the full information yet. She was going to get it on the ground. Kethon came up beside her in the landing bay as the bay doors opened to gray sky. "Commander, the human base has transmitted. They say they have made contact with the survivors." She looked at him. What kind of contact?" "They say non-hostile. They say a single human soldier located the crash site and has been with the Cubs for—" He checked the transmission timestamp. Over an hour. The landing ramp hit the ground, and she walked down it into the wind. The human base was visible to the northeast. She ignored it. She followed the beacon's last coordinates to the ravine. Kethon and 4 soldiers came behind her. She waved them back with one hand and went down into the ravine alone. What she saw stopped her at the bottom of the slope. Her children were alive. Both of them. Her younger, Palin, was asleep under a silver thermal blanket. Her older, Karen, was sitting upright, holding something in one forepaw, watching the human sitting across from them. The human was a male. Young by human standards, she judged. He was sitting with his back against the ravine wall, hands visible on his knees, making no sudden movements. He looked cold. His gear was standard infantry issue. He had no weapon drawn. He looked up when she came down. She watched his face do several things in rapid succession. Recognition that she was Vorakai. Recognition that she was armored. Then, instead of going for the weapon at his hip, he looked back at her children and then looked at her again. He said something in the human language. She had enough of it to understand the general meaning. "They're okay," he said. "The small one's sleeping. The other one's been eating. I didn't touch them." Karen looked at her, then looked at the human, then held up the protein stick it was still holding. Bethara stood very still. She had come down this ravine ready to end someone. She had not decided yet exactly how, but she had been certain there would be a reason. There was always a reason when humans and her children occupied the same space. The human had given her children food. The human had kept her children warm. The human had called his own command and told them to contact Vorkai forces to arrange extraction. She had that in the transmission log. She had read it twice on the way down. She looked at Karen again. "Are you hurt?" "No." Karen's voice was steady for a cub who had been in a crash. Palin's foreleg. The human did not touch it. "Did it approach you?" "No, it stayed back. It put the food on the ground and moved away." Karen looked at the human again. "It sat with us, Mother. For a long time, it did not leave." Bethara turned to look at the human fully. He met her eyes. He did not look away. For a human, that was either very brave or very stupid. And she was not yet sure which. She had 3 standard ways of dealing with humans she encountered in field conditions. None of them involved standing in a ravine, feeling something she did not have an immediate word for. She said, in careful human speech, "Your name?" He blinked, clearly not expecting her to speak his language. "Harlow. Dane Harlow. Dane Harlow." She repeated it the way the Vorkai said names, as a complete unit, like a thing being filed. She looked at her sleeping younger child and her older child with the protein stick. "You fed them?" "Yes." "You stayed?" "Yes." "Your command did not order this." A pause. Something went across his face that she could not fully read. "No, they didn't." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at Karen. "Come, wake your sibling." Karen moved to Pauline and woke them gently. Pauline sat up, still wrapped in the silver blanket. Pauline looked at the human, then at Vithara. "Mother," Pauline said. It was very cold. The human brought warmth. Vithara said nothing for a moment. Then she looked at Dane Harlow and said, in her own language, a phrase that had no direct human equivalent. The closest translation was something like, "This debt is carried." It was not a small thing in Vorakai culture. It was not said lightly. Dane Harlow obviously did not understand the words. But he nodded slowly, as if he understood that something significant had been said. She picked up Palin. Karen followed at her side. She walked back up the ravine slope. At the top, she stopped and turned back once. Dane Harlow was still sitting in the ravine. He was watching her. He raised one hand, an open gesture. She recognized it from the cross-species contact protocols. Non-threatening. Something close to a greeting. She turned away. Kethon fell in beside her as she walked. After a moment, he said quietly, "Commander, what do you intend to do about the human?" Vethara did not answer right away. "Find out more about him," she said finally. Kethon looked at her, said nothing, and made a note. Dane Harlow was eating a cold ration bar. The last one, not even the good flavor. Just a standard protein brick in the base mess hall when his commanding officer found him. Captain Laurie Vance sat down across from him without asking if the seat was available, which meant this was going to be a formal conversation dressed up as a casual one. "The Vorkai carrier left orbit 40 minutes ago," Laurie said. "Okay. You want to tell me what happened down there?" Dane looked at his ration bar. "I told you in my report. Your report says you gave 4 ration bars and a thermal blanket to 2 Vorkai juveniles, and then contacted us to arrange a handoff with Vorkai Command." Laurie folded her hands on the table. "And that's exactly what happened." "Yes. And you know that's technically a violation of the no-contact order." "Yes." Laurie looked at him for a moment. Vorkai Command sent a formal transmission to Fleet Headquarters, marked urgent, requesting the full service record of a human soldier identified as Dane Harlow, Corporal, stationed at Kaleth 9. She paused. They also marked it non-hostile, which is not something we have ever received from Vorkai Command. Dane set the ration bar down. "Okay. Fleet wants to know what you did to cause that." "I gave some kids food and sat with them so they weren't alone in the cold." Laurie was quiet. She looked like she was deciding something. "You could have left them." "Yes. The order said to ignore the beacon." "The order was wrong," Dane said. "Not with heat, just as a plain thing. I don't think ignoring 2 hurt kids is something I'm able to do, and I don't think it matters what species they are." Laurie looked at him for a long time. "Fleet is pulling your personnel file. They want to speak with you directly." She stood up. "They said it was not disciplinary." She paused. "They said the Vorkai transmission specifically asked that you not be punished for your actions, which is also something we have never received from them." She walked out. Dane sat alone in the mess hall. He picked his ration bar back up. It was dry and flavorless, and he ate the whole thing anyway because he had skipped 2 meals. His radio crackled. A different channel than base comms. A frequency he did not recognize. He looked at it. It crackled again, and then a voice came through, careful and deliberate, shaped around human syllables with a Vorkai accent that turned the edges of words into something sharper. "Dane Harlow." He picked up the radio. "This is Harlow. This is Vethara, War Commander. Carrier Vessel Designation 7. A pause. "I am transmitting on a private channel. This conversation is not recorded on my end. I do not know your protocols." Dane looked around the empty mess hall. "I can make that work on mine." "Good." Another pause. "My children told me what you did. All of it. Palin told me you sang." Dane closed his eyes briefly. He had sung. It was a stupid thing, a soft, repetitive thing his mother used to hum. And he had done it because Palin kept shaking and he hadn't known what else to do. He had not put that in his report. "It wasn't much," he said. "To a frightened cub far from home, it was not nothing." Her voice was even and measured. I am contacting you to tell you one thing. You are now under my protection. In Vorikai law, what you did creates an obligation. I owe a debt. That debt covers your life. A pause. If you are ever in a situation where my intervention could help you, you may call this frequency. Dane stared at the radio. I don't know what to say to that, he said honestly. You do not need to say anything. It is not a negotiation. It is a fact. Another pause. Your people will likely transfer you. You performed an action that will make your command uncomfortable. Humans do this. They find people who act outside the expected pattern, and they move them until they can be observed more closely. He laughed, short and involuntary. That's pretty accurate. Prepare for it. And Dane Harlow. Her voice shifted slightly. Not softer, more precise. My children know your name. That is not a small thing. The transmission ended. Dane set the radio down on the mess hall table. Outside the small porthole window, Caleth 9's gray sky was getting darker, and the wind was picking up again, and somewhere out past the edge of the system, a Vorikai carrier was burning toward jump speed. He thought about two small things eating ration bars in a freezing ravine. He thought about a thermal blanket being dragged with one careful paw. He picked up the radio and clipped it to his belt. The transfer came through in 72 hours, which was faster than Dane had expected and slower than Vethara had predicted. He was reassigned to Fleet Logistics aboard a mid-sized carrier called the CRS Aldrin, running supply coordination between the outer rim depots. It was a quiet post. It was the kind of post where they put people they didn't know what to do with, but couldn't justify punishing. He packed his kit. He did not complain. The CRS Aldrin was 3 weeks into its run when the incident happened. It was not a combat engagement. The Aldrin was not a warship. It was hauling medical supplies and repair components to a forward base called Depot 7 when 3 Vorikai fighters came out of the dust of an asteroid field and lit up the Aldrin's port side with targeting locks. 3 targeting locks was not an attack. It was a message. It meant, stop and be boarded. Captain Carol Finn, who ran the Aldrin with the energy of someone who had survived 15 years of frontier logistics by being harder to kill than the universe wanted, got on the ship wide and told everyone to stand by and keep their hands visible. She contacted the Vorikai fighters on the standard emergency frequency and asked what they wanted. What they wanted, it turned out, was Dane. Specifically, one of the Vorikai fighters transmitted a query asking if there was a human by the name of Dane Harlow aboard the vessel. The Carol came to find him herself, which told him this was serious enough that she wasn't going to delegate. You want to explain, she said, why a Vorikai fighter squadron is asking for you by name? Dane looked at the radio clipped to his belt. I might have a contact. Carol stared at him. It's complicated, he said. He transmitted on the private frequency. Vethara picked up in 30 seconds, which meant she was either very close or she had been waiting. You're in this sector, he said. I am never far from the border, she said. One of my forward units flagged your vessel in their patrol. I asked them to verify the crew manifest. I wanted to confirm you had been reassigned safely. A pause. I told you to prepare for it. You knew it would be this route? I know logistics. Your fleet has 4 supply routes to the outer depots. Given your post, this was the most likely. Another pause. I will withdraw my fighters. Your captain appears competent. She's going to have questions. Tell her what you like. Something in the tone shifted. Dane Harlow, you should know. I presented your file to the full Vorikai War Council 2 weeks ago. He went still. Why? Because you are an anomaly, and anomalies should be documented. A pause that felt different from the others. Heavier. There is a faction within the council who believes the current conflict is unwinnable for either side. They have been looking for a reason to reopen peace discussions. Your actions on Kaleth 9 were presented as evidence that individual humans are capable of choices outside the logic of war. Dane sat down on his bunk. That's a lot of weight to put on 4 ration bars. The bars were not the point. The point was that you stayed. You could have left food and gone. You chose to remain present. Her voice was precise. Presence is what the council understands. Resources are logistics. Presence is a decision. Carol was standing in the doorway of his bunk. She had stopped asking questions and was just listening now. What happens next? Dane said. I do not know. The council moves slowly. There are those who will argue against it. Another pause. But I wanted you to know you are part of a conversation you did not know you started. He looked at Carol. Carol raised her eyebrows at him. Okay, he said into the radio. Thank you for telling me. The fighters will withdraw now. A pause. Dane Harlow. Palin asked me to tell you something. He waited. They said to tell you the singing helped. They wanted you to know. The transmission ended. Carol walked in and sat down in the chair across from his bunk and looked at him for a long time. Outside the porthole, 3 Vorkai fighters peeled off the Aldrin's port side and disappeared back into the asteroid field. You have 45 minutes, Carol said, to explain all of that to me. Yes, ma'am, Dane said. He started from the beginning. The peace discussion did not happen quickly. Nothing at that scale ever did. But it happened. It took 14 months. It took 3 back-channel meetings held in neutral space, on a station that belonged to neither humans nor Vorkai. A drifting old refueling depot called Marker 6 that smelled like recycled air and engine grease, and had a mess hall where nothing on the menu was good enough to fight over. It took 2 human diplomats and 4 Vorkai council members and a communications officer who had mastered both languages well enough to catch the nuance gaps where things could go wrong. And it took, in the final session, when the language of the preliminary accord kept snagging on one phrase that neither side would agree to frame first, a request from the Vorkai delegation. They asked for Dane Harlow, not as a diplomat, not as a military representative. They did not want him at the table. They wanted him in the room. They wanted the human who had sat in a ravine on Kaleth 9 and given food to Vorkai children and stayed, just stayed, to be present in the room while the words were finalized. Fleet Command sent him with 1 day's notice and a clean uniform and strict instructions not to say anything unless directly addressed. Captain Carol Finn, who had apparently been making noise on his behalf for 14 months, had gotten him a formal commendation attached to the transfer orders. He read it once and folded it into his breast pocket. Marker 6's conference room was not impressive. The table was bolted to the floor and the chairs were the wrong height for Vorkai anatomy. So the Vorkai council members sat on low platforms that someone had improvised out of cargo crates and covered with fabric. The lighting was the flat white of a utility space. There were no windows. Dane stood against the back wall and kept his hands visible and did not say anything. Bethara was not at the table. She was also against the wall on the opposite side of the room. She was in full armor, which meant she was there in a protective capacity. When he came in, she looked at him once, and he looked at her, and that was all. Karen and Palin were not present. They were somewhere safer. He was glad. The session lasted 6 hours. At hour 4, The phrasing issue that had been blocking the accord came back around, and both delegations went quiet and looked at each other, and the communications officer was very carefully not looking at anyone. Dane did not plan to speak. He had the orders. He understood the orders. He spoke anyway. "Can I ask what the phrase is?" he said. Every head in the room turned to look at him. "Corporal." The lead human diplomat started. "Please," Dane said. "Well, what's the phrase?" The communications officer looked at both delegations, got some form of permission from the silence, and said, "The Vorkai use a term that means roughly, 'this debt is carried.' The human delegation's translation renders it as an admission of fault, which is a different thing. The Vorkai delegation says that is not what it means." Dane looked across the room at Vethara. She was very still. "It's not about fault," he said to the room, to no one, to the air. "It's about the fact that something happened between people that matters enough to carry forward. It's not an apology. It's a recognition." He paused. "It means we were both there, and we remember. We're choosing to carry it instead of putting it down." The room was quiet. The lead Vorkai council member said something in Vorkai that the communications officer translated, slowly. The council member says the human has stated it correctly. He asks how the human knows this phrase. Dane looked at his hands. "Someone said it to me once, in a ravine. I didn't understand it then. I looked it up later." Another exchange. The communications officer almost smiled. The council member says he would like to use the human's definition in the text. The human diplomatic lead looked at Dane like she was reassessing several things she had previously believed to be true. Then she looked at the text in front of her and said, "We can work with that." It took another 2 hours, but it was done before midnight. Dane was the last one out of the room. Burdas, the delegations had gone to separate areas of the station to review the agreed text. The communications officer had gone with them. The room was empty. Vethara was waiting in the corridor. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said in careful human speech, "You spoke when you were told not to." "Yes," he said. "It was the correct choice. Thank you." She looked at him for another moment. "Karin is finishing their first combat training cycle. Palin is studying language. Yours, among others." A pause. "Palin is very good at the singing parts." Dane laughed. It was a real one. It came out before he could decide whether it was appropriate. Something shifted in Vethara's expression. It was not a human expression. But he had spent 14 months looking up Vorkai behavioral cues because he had known, and somewhere in the back of his mind, that this conversation was coming. It was the closest thing to warmth that Vorkai faces could make. "The debt is carried," she said. "Dane Harlow." "The debt is carried," he said back. She walked down the corridor and he watched her go, armor catching the flat white light, and he thought about a freezing ravine and a thermal blanket and 2 small things eating food they'd never tasted before. He put his hand in his breast pocket and felt the shape of the folded commendation. Somewhere out in the dark of the system, past the scratched portholes of Marker 6, 2 sides of a 14-year war were reading the same words for the first time and finding that they fit. He walked out to find Carol Finn, who had somehow gotten herself assigned as his escort. Because she was Carol Finn, and she did not miss things like this. She handed him a cup of something hot. "Well?" she said. "I think it worked," he said. "Good," she said. "You can tell me the whole story, again, from the beginning." She looked at him. "I want to get it right this time." He took the cup and started talking, and the station hummed around them, and the war, for the first time in 14 years, was something that used to be.